after Microsoft kept shoving AI into everything while announcing the end of support for Windows 10 and some guy from Sweden switching his OS, the Linux community started cheering, because the amount of people being interested in switching to Linux keeps increasing. Also, gaming on Linux just gets better and better, especially with Steam and their Steam Deck on their side. But what about people who use their PCs for creative work? What about people like me? Well, I am brave enough to find out and will test it myself. I want to know what the experience on Linux is like, how much on using the terminal it really relies, how native Linux applications like Blender and DaVinci perform, and if we're also able to get the Affinity suite running without having to cry. Also, I have an Nvidia GPU, which makes things difficult. As you can see, I am still on Windows 10. I really customized Windows 10, because you wouldn't understand my personality without it. Also, my CPU is an i7 6700K, which isn't natively supported by Windows 11. I know there is the option of bypassing these requirements, but it usually comes with further trouble, like not receiving the feature updates. My goal is creating a dual boot system with both Windows and Linux. Why dual boot? Because if there are some applications that are crucial for me that can't be run smoothly on Linux, I will just boot into Windows for that. Also, it's useful if Linux should completely overwhelm me to have something I can fall back to. While I am putting these words together in my script, my experiment has already been going on for a month. I've used virtual machines to test different Linux distros, because one of Linux strengths is that you can choose between different distros that come with different benefits. But it is also a weakness of Linux, because as a beginner it is very overwhelming. And for every person that recommends a certain distro, there's one person that claims it sucks. I've joined multiple subreddits about Linux to learn about Linux and the community on a daily basis. And doing that, I found a website called distros, where you can run different distros in your browser. This really helped me getting a feel of what difference there are between distros. Honestly, most of them are pretty similar, and your choice seems to narrow down to like 3 factors. On what distro should your distro be based? Debian, Arch, or Ubuntu? And even Ubuntu is based on the unstable version of Debian, so it mostly is Debian or Arch. Second question, what desktop environment do you like? KDE Plasma or maybe GNOME? And the last question, do you rely on graphical user interfaces? Because some distros like plain Arch require more command line usage than others. Of course, each distro also has its own set of packages it ships with, which might lead to differences in compatibility. Also, some distros like Ubuntu Studio are specifically designed for creatives, which may sound like it's exactly what I'm looking for, but after trying it on distros, I found that it didn't focus on what's important to me. I already had experience with Linux Mint because my school used it on all of their computers. And it's really similar to Windows. Like, we've used it in 5th grade and some didn't even seem to notice that it isn't Windows. I used my mini PC to test different distros on real hardware, because on virtual machines or distros, which I think are also virtual machines, but I'm not completely sure, the experience just isn't exactly the same. On my mini PC, I've tried Arch, Debian and Manjaro. I was already quite happy with Debian because I was looking for something stable, but it was a bit too stable, which means updates take quite a while until they are considered stable enough to be integrated in the stable release, which ultimately is the definition of stable, but it was more stable than I expected. Now, Manjaro and Arch are the opposite, since they are rolling release distros, so you get updates pretty much as quickly as possible, which is cool, but of course can impact the stability. In fact, Manjaro is based on Arch, but it has more graphical user interfaces and updates take a bit longer than in Arch until you receive them. And on my mini PC, all of those distros worked like a charm. Installation was easy and the performance was better than on Windows. I just ran into some issues because my USB stick, which I've used for the installations, was corrupted multiple times. And that's some annoying troubleshooting, because you really have to start all over. Also, my mini PC has built-in speakers, and when I was navigating through the boot menu UI or was in the installation terminal of Arch, it just kept making annoying beep sounds whenever I did something wrong. And my mini PC doesn't have a volume control knob or something similar, so I had no choice but to listen, which kinda sounds like a trap from Saw. Like, you're locked in a room and need to brute force a password locked door to escape, but with every wrong password, an explosive in your ear goes off. I've kept Manjaro on my mini PC and it will also stay there, because the performance really is better and I mainly use it on vacation for browsing and cloud gaming. so I decided to choose Manjaro as my distro to be installed alongside Windows on my main machine. So I followed a guide and made settings like turning off the page file and hibernation of Windows, and also prepared some partitions for Linux to be installed on. I also ran through all my files and did a deep cleanup. I was able to free about 1 terabyte of space in total. Don't ask me what was on there, okay? I also backed up the most important data in the cloud. I've used the other cloud because it was comparably cheap and in the EU, but I'm not sponsored or anything. I would take money if it would offer some though. And after several reboots and troubleshooting, I've managed to get Manjaro installed, so it was time to make myself familiar with it. And after 2 days of using Manjaro, it broke and I had to uninstall it. Well, broke is a big word for what happened, but let me elaborate. In contrast to my mini PC, I've had major issues with Manjaro because the NVIDIA support let me down. I think Manjaro installed the wrong driver for me because I have 2 monitors and a drawing tablet with a display. My secondary monitor and my display tablet both only work over HDMI, but my GPU only has 1 HDMI port. So my secondary monitor's HDMI cable was in the HDMI port of my mainboard, which means it uses the integrated graphics from my Intel CPU. And during troubleshooting, I've noticed Manjaro installed a graphics driver called Hybrid Intel NVIDIA Prime. I've tried multiple sets of different drivers and followed guides to fix it, but every time I fixed one issue, another issue was born. Either everything was lagging, I had major screen artifacts and glitches, or applications weren't able to use my GPU at all, which kept some softwares like Blender from starting. And that's one of the apps I need, and probably the one that should have the best Linux support, since it's a native support. So something clearly wasn't right. I don't know who is to blame here. I tried out different desktop environments, different drivers, different settings, different compositors, also unplugged my tablet completely and connected all my displays only to my GPU. But after like 10 hours of trying to find a way to make everything work, I was faced with a black screen because my display drivers didn't load at all. And this time I wasn't even able to get into the terminal. This took a lot of my excitement and motivation, but I won't give up just yet. It's just really problematic for me that I am not sure what's the reason behind the poor NVIDIA support, because I don't know what I would have to fix. Like, imagine you would be hired as, I don't know, a mechanic, and you are just dropped off in a huge room with all kinds of stuff, and the person who hired you just says, yeah, would be nice if you would fix that, and then just leaves you alone. I thought, maybe it's the distro after all. So I took some research if there is perhaps a distro that works better with NVIDIA GPUs. I've heard some mixed opinions about Pop! OS. Some people recommended Manjaro, some people recommended Bazide, and some CachyOS. This was the first time I've heard of CachyOS and it catched my interest, so I will give it a try. I also gained some knowledge from my Manjaro installation, because I installed Manjaro on my M2 SSD, where also my Windows is installed on. But this time I will just install it on my SATA SSD, because maybe that's part of the problem. I will also this time install it without any display cable in my mainboard, hoping it will help the OS selecting the right driver for me. I hope my tablet will still work when just plugging it in afterwards. So let's create a bootable USB with Rufus. Since the Rufus window is pretty small, I've created a black background with my mad hacker skills. And then put Rufus there because it looks better for screen recording this way. Okay, let's try booting. Remember me bragging about my screen recording 5 seconds ago? Yeah, I've upgraded my setup to sick shaky mobile recording. But I mean, did you expect someone who's still on Windows 10 and isn't fully monetized on YouTube to have a fancy capture card? By the way, you need 1000 subscribers to be fully monetized. Wink, wink. Ah, did you hear that, Gertrude? Now we know what to get the boy for Christmas. But don't worry, this recording quality is only for the installation. So yeah, I've disabled secure boot in the BIOS and prioritized the USB to boot from. This all worked, and CachyOS already has an NVIDIA module it can be installed with. It states open source, but apparently it's not to be confused with the open source and non-free NVIDIA driver. On online forums, people with the same GPU said they have no problems with the open source model. So I chose this. Both my monitors got recognized, which is a good sign, and after like 3 minutes I was on the desktop and could launch the installer. A very basic settings to do here, just the partitions are a bit tricky. Cachy also has a lot of desktop environments to choose from. Since Wayland is sometimes a bit broken on NVIDIA, I wanted one on X11. In the end I went with XFCE4 because it's fast and minimal, so there shouldn't be anything compromising the compatibility. Then I was able to take a look at what's going to be installed and what the disk partitioning looks like, and then could hit install, which took about 10 minutes to finish. I rebooted and got to the bootloader, which are installed in a stupid way because I can only boot into Kachy from here and not to either Kachy or Windows. But at least it has a cool vaporwave look. So yeah, I installed OBS now, and I had to adjust some basic settings like scaling, hotkeys and enabling dark mode. OBS already complained a bit about not being able to encode, and I've also had screen tearing again when moving windows. So I had a bad feeling. I installed Blender through the GUI installer and gave it a test. And it worked so much better than in Manjaro, because in Manjaro everything was lagging in the viewport, which might have been due to Wayland or Plasma KDE, but as I said, I don't know. I wanted to give rendering a try, so I downloaded the classic classroom scene of Blender and gave it a test. And it worked really good this time, both with CUDA and optics. I really didn't expect that. So far CachyOS really surprised me. I've also rendered the same scene on the same machine on Windows, and I got a slightly better performance on Linux. And this wasn't a completely fair comparison, because I did some optimizations on my Windows and also have my GPU overclocked there. So it's even more impressive that Linux still was better. Now I wanted to test things with DaVinci Resolve. On Manjaro I remembered having to delete some libraries from the installation folder so DaVinci would start. Let's see what happens this time. For some reason I couldn't run the downloaded installer, which is ironic for a file extension that calls itself .run. I was pretty sure that on Manjaro I could just double click it and it would run. So I installed DaVinci over the Arch user repository instead, by using the Octopi GUI. So again, you can get around the terminal for installing stuff. This is DaVinci 19 instead of the 20 beta I wanted, but maybe that will work. The installation was a success and it started, but over both my monitors, so I couldn't reach it. But having this window usually means it works. So I just restarted to see if that fixes it, and it did. I could successfully create a project. I've tested the performance a bit and the playback was good, maybe even a bit faster than on Windows, but hard to tell. What I'm really interested in is seeing if the Starfield works, because it uses the hardware renderer of the Fusion 3D render, which didn't work on my Manjaro installation. And it also worked. So far everything works. The only issue I sometimes have is screen tearing from moving windows on the desktop, but really only there and not in applications, so it's okay. Also I somehow can't move DaVinci Resolve around, which is annoying, but I keep it on one display anyway. So both Blender and DaVinci Resolve work really well, but they have native Linux support. What about software that doesn't have native Linux support, like Affinity Photo? Let's give that a try. For the Affinity suite, you will have to run it over Vine, which is an application that makes Windows apps compatible with Linux. Of course, it's not 100% like a native support, but let's see for ourselves how well it will run. I followed a guide from the Affinity forums because you need a special fork of Vine. The instructions may look complicated, but most of the commands are just making directories and installing things into them. One of them took 30 minutes to execute and ended up in an error, but there was no information about that error in the guide I was following. So I tried just continuing with the guide anyway. So yeah, it took even more time, and you will need some files from a Windows PC or a virtual Windows machine to make it run. Good thing I'm on a dual boot, so I can just copy the files. But in the end, the installation on Wine failed and I wasn't able to fix it. So I couldn't make Affinity run. 2 hours wasted. I was kind of fed up after the failed installation process, so I've called it a day. And the next day I was interested in seeing if KDE Plasma will now work without issues, because I liked it more than XFCE, and after installing and switching to it, I had to correctly arrange my displays again first. I really like the customization. You have a lot of options in Plasma. A cool thing about Plasma is that you can design the panel to either look like Windows taskbar or the dock from macOS. So far everything seemed functional, but I wanted to know for good and gave Blender a test. And it worked perfectly. I also examined the classroom scene again to test the real-time capabilities, and it worked pretty good. The open image denoising from Intel also was noticeably faster than on Windows for me. Eevee also worked fine. I could walk through the scene with no lags at all. Also, the scene is very detailed. There is this room you never see, wall sockets that are behind the default camera position, and the textures in the back are so high resolution that you can fully read them, like this text from a transgender student. Now I continued trying to get my display tablet to work. I plugged it in and booted up, which made all my screens flash up occasionally, and then I was only facing black screens. But I figured I'm probably on the login page right now, so I just blindly typed in my password and hit enter, which got me onto the desktop again. Without any further steps, I could use my tablet as an input device with correct pressure sensitivity in Krita, but the scaling was way off. My tablet was mapped across both of my monitors. Oh, also my tablet didn't display anything yet, and I faced performance issues again everywhere after I plugged it in. Plus my KDE didn't recognize my tablet, so it wasn't any help. So I downloaded the official drivers and installed them. I rebooted a couple of times and I got my tablet to display something, but in the end I couldn't fix the mapping issue, which ultimately made it unusable for me. This is where I initially wanted to enter testing, but while I was in the kitchen sliding a pizza in the oven, I started to wonder. The issues I had when plugging in my display tablet were extremely similar to the issues I had on Manjaro. Everything was lagging. When I installed CachyOS, I had my tablet unplugged and both my monitors were connected to my GPU. I will also this time install it without any display cable in my main board. When I installed Manjaro, my secondary monitor was still connected to my mainboard. What if that was the cause of my issues? I just had to find out. So I've pulled out the old reliable 4GB USB stick and put Manjaro onto it. Yeah, everything works now. Wayland still gave me artifacts, but this time applications like Blender worked on Wayland. I've also spent 8 more hours trying to get Affinity to work, but the documentation of the custom wine fork is very thin and not updated regularly. I made progress. I was able to get Affinity trying to start, but not any further. I also followed like 4 different guides and tried different branches, but could get none of them to work. But what I got on this installation overall is pretty much the experience I was expecting. Everything worked with a noticeable better performance than on Windows, great customization, but issues with non-native applications. I think it's time to wrap things up. Of course, Linux is often compared to Windows, and there are distros that feel familiar to Windows users. But that won't change the fact that Linux is fundamentally different to Windows. The best thing about Linux, in my opinion, is the fact that it's open source, comes with less bloat, gives more power to the user, collects less data, and has a better performance. The best thing about Windows is that you don't have to worry about compatibility and that you're familiar to it. So there isn't too much on Windows side, but a lot of people care about those advantages Windows brings. The thing about the compatibility is, it's not really the fault of Linux. It's just that a lot of companies don't care about offering Linux support because the market doesn't really exist. And you might be rightfully furious about that, but keep in mind that it also increases the expense of a product when having to make sure it also runs flawless on one more platform. Which also means that for creatives, the experience on Linux is tightly bound to your choice of software. If you need applications with no native Linux support like Adobe or Affinity products, you might probably be better off to just bite the bullet and continue using Windows or macOS. Some people were able to get them to work, but as you could see in my experience, it is not guaranteed to work and far from a smooth, reliable experience out of the box. And in general, the Affinity products are known to be poorly supported by Wine. Also, it might break when trying to update the software. So don't get your hopes too high on the support of non-native Linux apps, especially if you're planning on using these applications in professional environments, where you are bound to keep deadlines. If you're wondering why I've put so much focus on the Affinity products, the answer is quite simple. I paid for them, and it would kinda hurt in the wallet to just leave that behind. Even worse is that you might be limited to your choice of hardware. You can get lucky and don't have any trouble at all, or don't get anything to work. With my GPU and tablet problems, I am further on the trouble side. To be fair, you also get NVIDIA driver problems on Windows. Especially lately it's been a thing. I took a lot of preparation before actually trying Linux on my main machine, and getting a bad experience nonetheless really was a punch in the face. There were so many reboots and reinstallations where I just had to wait in anticipation whether it would fix my problems or not. I've spent like 10 hours only trying to get the right driver and make it work, and failed in the end. which made me and my genitals turn Microsoft. Yo, who wrote the script? My evil twin, whoa.
Wow.
Initially, I really liked the snappy experience of Linux, but it became harder for me to enjoy because the countless numbers of troubleshooting from before really stripped away a lot of my motivation. Blender had a better performance though, which I can't really benefit from as a workstation, but I use a dual boot of PopOS to render longer animations, because even if each frame only renders 6 seconds faster, I would save 1 hour of render time every 600 frames. So my current setup is Windows for working and PopOS for rendering. And I have to say, I like the GNOME-based desktop environments of PopOS more than KDE Plasma. When testing different environments, Plasma seemed like a better fit because of all of the out-of-the-box customizations. But when actually working on it, I preferred the UX of GNOME, and the managing of a multi-monitor setup felt easier. My initial choice was also a bit influenced by the names. Like, Plasma just sounds cool, and GNOME just sounds kinda silly in comparison. So if you plan on switching to Linux, you might consider trying to migrate to softwares that have a native Linux support first. If you just spend your whole time trying to get Windows apps to work, you will probably be very frustrated. If you stick to natively supported apps, your experience will just be so much better and enables you to fully enjoy the advantages of Linux. I mean, if you would try to get unsupported software for Windows running all day, you would also be frustrated. I will stay on Windows for now, as I seem to need more time switching to Linux. Also, I actually learned most from having it on my main machine, so setting up a dual boot first and just actually trying it would be my recommendation. You can also keep things simple, like my PopOS installation only uses 100 GB currently. If you're in a similar boat and stick to Windows for now, I can also recommend you trying to de-Microsoft your Windows by disabling things like telemetry, bloatware, Bing search in the taskbar, background services you don't need, sharing your Windows updates, and there really is so much you can hate on Windows. If you don't get why and you're on Windows right now, just press Windows Ctrl-Shift-Alt and L and see what happens. I promise it's nothing bad, but just do it and look at this shit. Also, tools like Everything or PowerToys are a must-have for Windows users. Anyway, I do like Linux, and you really aren't bound to using the terminal anymore, depending on the distro. Like, many distros already come with graphical installers for the OS and the software. So, while it would still be smart to learn how to use the terminal, it's not a must if you just want to install some apps, launch them, close them, turn your PC off, drive 4 hours to your secret second family, spend time with them and go to bed. I hope the creative people here could get a valuable insight from my experience, and that the Linux fans will also be able to understand my opinion and see that I am not a Linux hater. That's all. Subscribe if you want to, would be cool.